So again, let me just welcome everybody back to our follow-up conversation from last Sunday. It's hard to believe it's been a week. I don't know if you'll notice, but based on some of the things that Phoebe offered us last week, I changed this from biodiversity loss to biodiversity love, loss, and healing, because that was our emphasis last week, and the place of hope and empowerment for all of us is to realize how much we love this beautiful world and our desire to heal what is being broken. So as I welcome Phoebe back, I wanted to bring up this beautiful tapestry picture that she showed us last time. And I'm wondering if this quote is from you. I'm kind of thinking it might be. And also just to ask you, as I gazed and looked at this with attention, I noticed that you selected for a tapestry a tree. And I wondered if that had as much to do with the forest cathedrals that you love and shared with us, or if it might also have been the symbol of the tree of life and the way that evolution has brought all this tapestry, this web of life into being. So just by way of welcome, that's a question to bring us back together into conversation.
So. Thank you, Laurie. I think many of you will recognize this tapestry, even if you don't know it by name. It's William Morris's medieval Tree of Life tapestry, one of his best known, and so known now that you can go online and buy it from places like Pier 1 Imports and places like that, I think. Yes, it is my text to the right of it. No particular fancy quote. It's just thoughts that I had while choosing it. I think a tree of life speaks to me both as someone who was trained in evolutionary biology, like yourself, in understanding the relationships between ourselves and other species, but also evokes an entire ecosystem. Anyone who has ever spent time in a forest, even in the northern climes, but particularly in tropical climes, will understand how rich is the community of organisms living in that canopy. So it seemed to me to be a suitable starting point.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the molecular biologist in me, thinks of all these amazing trees of life. And then Darwin's comment, there's grandeur in this view of life from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And it kind of reminded me of something else that you said the other day that is going to drive our first question in our first breakout group, which is, you noticed how enchanting and lovely and exquisite is this planet. I think you topped Darwin there with that comment. And so what we wanted to invite our folks to do in just a quick breakout group at maybe just 10 minutes, to allow everyone who is assembling to consider that same question that Phoebe kind of gave to us. What do you find enchanting and lovely and exquisite about our planet and the life that inhabits it? And then also remembering, just as a way to remember, we heard that beautiful dawn chorus last week from Phoebe. And what we heard was that noticing that she brought to over time to how the dawn chorus had gotten smaller and less diverse with time. And so just asking also that question, where have you noticed diminishment in biodiversity over the course of your lifetime? Yeah. So rather than expanding on that, I just want to give us 10 minutes to do that in small groups, and then we're going to come back and move into questions and answers with Phoebe. So is that okay? And I also want to notice, are we recording when we come back? Yeah, okay.
We are.
So I'm going to get out of screen share if I can, and I'm going to let Sean put us into our breakout groups when he's ready. Anyway, welcome back to everyone. I'm assuming everyone's back. And the first thing we're going to do is invite you to share in the chat something that you heard about the diminishment or loss of species that people have brought their noticing, they're gazing even here at something we may not want to see. And put those in the chat. We're going to read those a little bit, and we're going to let Phoebe pick a few of those to hear a little bit more. So I'm assuming Phoebe's back. No?
I'm here.
Oh, good. There you are.
Yeah, I'm having a look at the chat contributions. Please keep putting your thoughts in, particularly Alan, who was just starting a thought on that when we got whisked back into the other virtual hyperspace. So many things are
loss of species like salmon, honeybees, frogs, turtles, possums, robins. Go ahead, Phoebe. I just wanted to get those before they disappeared.
Yeah, absolutely. Last week I was showing you a couple of slides. You remember there was a little quiz about what strange bird is this, and it was a secretary bird of Africa that stomps around the savannas and eats snakes. And I was telling you about early warning systems for biodiversity and how citizen scientists can help observe changes in species in space and time to develop big data sets on these things. And I realized during the years of developing and running that program in Southern Africa, that it's so much easier for people to observe new species moving in that they've never seen before. It's much harder for us without systematic projects to be able to notice when a species just stops coming. And that danger is falling, species are falling through the cracks because it's hard for us to notice that they're not there. And then we have to think, wait a minute, when was the last year that I actually saw a varied thrush or, a trumpeter swan or even a monarch butterfly? When was the last time? And it's, unless we're keeping notes and we're following a systematically designed program, it's hard to get that information. So your comments in the chat are very helpful. I think I want to just ask about salmon, because I'm living here in the Pacific Northwest and a number of you are. We have lost salmon in numbers and in species from certain parts, certain river systems, and the Salish Sea as a whole. It's a big problem, not only for orca whales, but for the whole functioning of our ocean ecosystems. It develops for us a food security problem. Does anyone else have comments on salmon or other fish that they have observed? Roger, do you want to comment?
I saw an article, a scientific article recently about the salmon situation in the Northwest. And what they were saying is they've discovered what's poisoning the salmon and why they're not doing real well. That there is an ingredient in your tires on your vehicle. And it's a poison that, your tires wear on roads. So places where the road is near the stream, that powder gets into the stream and kills salmon. It's a poison to them, but it's a preservative to make your tires last longer.
And isn't this the problem that we have with our society? We come up with innovations that are economic in nature or practical in nature, and we want to become famous, we want to earn money, so these innovations get into our economy. And often we're not thinking of the broader implications, and we don't have the regulatory agencies often being effective in looking out for those you know, unintended consequences on our behalf. It's a real problem. My house here in Mount Vernon, Washington, is right near the Skagit River, the only river that still has all 5 salmon in it. I sit on the Skagit Watershed Council, and we have a salmon creek going right by our house. It's very degraded. So many problems are driving the loss of salmon. Chemical pollutants, damming of rivers, overfishing. You know, it's like a lethal cocktail, and we have to be so mindful of these things and stop judging merits of what we do just by our economic values. Anybody else? I know that Rod mentioned bumblebees, so if
so
anyone...
we're going to have a question on bees coming up.
Okay.
Susan's going to be
until then.
Yep, coming up. I'm going to go ahead and go to the
did you want
go into our PowerPoint.
Okay.
You don't have time for Woody and Jody's question?
Oh, sure. I'll just do this and then we'll be ready. But yeah, let's go ahead with yes.
Woody and Jody, you may need to unmute still.
You on?
Yeah, now you are.
Okay. We live in Northeast Oklahoma. We're in the country. Time was when I was a kid, several years ago, we could go out and walk through a pasture. We've got acres here that we could walk through, and there would be Peter cottontails. We call them cottontail rabbits. And they were thick. I mean, even during the Depression, people would come and kill rabbits for people to eat. They kill truckloads of them and take them in town and give them away for people to eat. That's not what destroyed them, though. I think right now you can go through. I could go out here, and I doubt if I could find a rabbit today. And it used to be. I mean, we could walk all afternoon, probably not find a rabbit. I think what has happened is we have a large number of coyotes. And I think the coyotes are feeding on the rabbits and have killed them off. There's nothing to. The coyotes have no predators except human beings, and that's not they don't hunt, very many people hunt them, they're not worth anything. So that's been a real issue here. And the coyotes also make dens in the ground and make real bad issues for driving over to hay because your tractor falls into it. It's pretty bad sometimes. So that's been an issue here with losing the rabbits and the increase in the coyotes.
Coyotes may be part of the problem, although they generally respond to prey numbers rather than determine prey numbers, if you see what I mean. But rabbits are also subject to diseases in many parts of the world, like myxomatosis. So maybe you're observing a time where unseen disease like COVID-19 in our population is affecting rabbits. I'm not sure. Would be interesting observation. Thank you.
We have something here called the Macho Yahoo. It's a male that drives a big 4-wheel drive truck, and he gets together with his buddies, and they go out into the country out near Chilliwack, and they drive their trucks at full speed back and forth through the salmon breeding creeks and streams.
Oh my.
Killing all the eggs and squashing all the baby salmon. And
They're driving across the rivers, Gary?
Yeah, shallow, where the rivers are shallow, where the salmon breed and lay their eggs. They're racing their trucks back and forth through that area and killing all the whatever's in there.
It's been on our news.
Well, we've got to figure out a way to stop that for sure.
The government won't do anything. They're not doing anything about it. It's been on the news and people are complaining and up in arms about it, but nothing seems to happen. The police don't interfere and the government doesn't do anything so far.
Could I ask you, Gary, to do me a favor and send Laurie or Rod a link to something that I can take up with our folks and figure out what's going on here in Skagit County anyway, on that line, or Washington?
I'm sure they both, or at least Rod would have access to it now. So
Sure.
I think we just have to archive some newspaper article or something, or TV video. So
Yeah, no, that's horrific. Thank you for telling us that this country has a whole bunch of problems like that. I did notice that Nan Sargent, thank you, Nan, reported 15 different species of songbirds in the morning dawn chorus. And I'm always happy to hear that. That's a good number. I'm not sure that I would have been able to count 15 if I'd listened this morning carefully. Maybe 10. She's got an app. Well done. That's good.
So I love this expansion of our noticing, this invitation to notice, to gaze even here, for those of you who've been with this series for a while, to gaze at those places where there is suffering so that we can protect the beauty of this planet, our willingness to hold our recognition of these things. So we do have a number of questions, and so I'm good. Are we okay to, I'm gonna move us forward a little bit. All right, so Sean, you're gonna let me know, are you seeing the right thing this time?
Yes, we are.
Okay,
yep.
Good. So this was just a comment on, to add on to the tapestry as a way to visualize every little ball on this picture represents a species, and this was a three-dimensional thing that was created to help people understand just how complex and amazing these interdependent systems of organisms are. And one person in my group shared that was what they noticed that was so exquisite, was all this interdependent connection. Mm-hmm. And that we're all a family. So Susie's going to read this poem for us, and then we're going to ask Phoebe some more questions on biodiversity thoughts.
It's an excerpt from Mary Oliver's Moss. What a wild family. Fox and giraffe and warthog, of course. But these also. Bodies like tiny strings, bodies like blades and blossoms, cordgrass, Christmas fern, soldier moss. And here comes grasshopper, all toes and knees and eyes over the little mountains of dust. When I see a black cricket in the woodpile in autumn, I don't frighten her. When I touch the moss grazing upon the rock, I touch her gently and tenderly, sweet cousin.
All of the creatures who are on this poem these pictures are all taken from the IUC and that Phoebe mentioned last week, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List, threatened or endangered species. Well, these ones are threatened at the time I took these off, which was a few years ago. They're still with us, but they're all struggling, which leads us into the first question that we had from last time. Joe asked if we could have a copy of Phoebe's bar graph and an explanation of the levels of species lost among a variety of species. So the first question just is, can you just say a little bit about the threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered categories? And then Susan, after that, Susan Oxley's going to ask a question about tipping points relative to bees and plankton. So again, everybody wants to minimize their screen, or should I take the screen down so that you all can just see each other?
Can you keep it up just for a minute while we're talking about this bar chart, Laurie? Thanks.
Okay.
So, you know, you will all be able intuitively to grasp, even if you haven't seen stuff about red data species or this particular bar chart before, just visually with the color coding, unless you're colorblind, I guess, that that we move from species of least concern, not saying that we have no concerns about their conservation, but they're in the best off category in green, all the way down through critically endangered, and then what we hope never to see, but are increasingly seeing extinct in the wild. There's also the category, which is pretty important, although less interesting to people, but for scientists, the category in gray there, data deficient, is really of concern because we don't know enough about species to know that many are not falling through the cracks. And that's particularly the case with the microorganisms, including the soil microorganisms that are so crucial for our food security and our gut health and our mental health and well-being. Many of those are data deficient species, but you don't even see those kinds of categories on this graph, do you? If you look at the left, you'll see a whole bunch of vertebrate species like fishes and birds and mammals, but we're only really looking at what we conventionally thought of as the kind of pinnacles of creation on this graph. There are vast quantities of species that we never think about, never see, but completely drive our food systems, our oxygen production, you know, all of the essential ecosystem services that we depend on. The stuff in red and dark red is probably committed to extinction over the next 100 years if we are not careful. We do not want to be losing so many amphibians and fish and birds and mammals, but we are. And so trying to move the color slide on this graph increasingly to green and keep the red at bay is the focus of what we do as conservation biologists. There are, I think the last thing I'll say is there are a number of much more quantitative ways of assigning species to each category than we had 15 years ago. And my colleague now just recently died, the wonderful British academic Dame Georgina Mace at the University College London was responsible for reframing the entire system of showing how we can think of species and assign them into threat categories. And she really helped make our process much more rigorous scientifically. But, you know, it's just like stoplights. Green is good, red is bad. We want to keep the red in conservation at bay as far as we can.
Thanks. I did take the liberty of going to their website so that people could see the,
yeah.
And I just pulled, so I just again screenshot, and I like the fact that this is actually where they're just saying take action. There are, if you go to the website, ways, I'm sure financial, but I don't know if there's some citizen science involved there or not, but just so people can see that.
Thank you, Laurie. That's really helpful. I should have included a slide like this because people need to realize that nearly half of frogs and salamanders are now committed to extinction or threatened with extinction. And when I use the phrase committed to extinction, that's a little bit of a scientific statistical thing, but basically we need to understand that by the time a species makes it onto these red lists, they're in trouble and we are not in a good position to be able to do something about it. Honestly, until we reframe the way we live, the way we run our economy, the way we value different things in life, and the way we run our communities.
All right. So thank you. Susan is going to ask a question while I try to find my stop screen share button, which has disappeared. Otherwise, you're just going to, we'll just look at this and keep going. But go ahead, Susan.
Phoebe, I've noticed in articles a variety of comments about some of the foundational organisms to our food chains, like the plankton, the krill in the ocean, and then also the pollinators on land and insects, and the diminishment that has been seen. For instance, 80% of the krill that were in existence in the 1970s are now gone. And with plankton, you know, everything from whales to small fish, and you know, the whole food chain depends a lot on plankton and krill. How close is the tipping point in those species? And is there some, if we reach, the question is, if we reach the point where those species begin dying off, what can we do about that? What can shift there?
Those are hard questions, and to be honest, it's difficult to put a good spin on them, but we still have the time to do many things, particularly with how we treat our oceans. The loss of complexity in our oceans affects the dominance of krill and sardines and mackerel and jellyfish and other components of our ocean ecosystem. And many of you may have heard that in some parts of the world, including Namibia, where I was the director of biodiversity and climate change for some time, that there had been a sudden profusion of jellyfish. And it was linked largely to overfishing, disrupting the balance of the food web, so that some whole groups of species were becoming very, very rare, and jellyfish were just taking up the slack. And so you would look out over the ocean and you would just, especially if you could be in a plane or fly a drone up over the ocean, you would just see masses of jellyfish. That really worried me, because we are playing with our food security, we are playing with our health. And those of you who are thinking, yes, ocean plastics, that is part of it. Every section of our marine ecosystem has many species that are ingesting microplastics. If you are still using nanoparticle dishcloths, and if you are still wearing fleeces, like I'm afraid I'm using, this is a secondhand fleece, but it's nonetheless a fleece that that I took on from a friend when she left the country, and I put it through the wash. Each of these things is distributing nanoparticles of plastics into our river systems and thus into our ocean. And we should be phasing these things out. In addition, of course, plastic bottles and plastic shopping bags and all of the stuff that gets swept off continents whenever there's a tsunami, that is all the mega plastics, if you like, that are ending up in the big gyres of each ocean. And those have effects too, but it's often the microplastics that are affecting krill and other parts of the ocean ecosystem so profoundly, and we haven't been aware of it up until quite recently. I think you all know, how many people have actually heard it said that each of us ingests the equivalent amount of plastics of a credit card every week or month. That's a horrendous statistic. Has anyone else heard that? Raise your hand if you have. That is about the biggest early warning flag that we can get. If we have been polluting our environment, and especially our oceans, with plastic so much that we cannot be eating fish of any kind or shellfish without ingesting plastics that they have taken into their bodies, it's not just a problem for us, it's a problem for them and our whole food system. So I am extremely worried about ocean pollution and the trophic effects on krill, Susan. When I first went off to Africa, I very nearly worked on albatrosses. I tried to get on a ship that was going to Antarctica, and I wanted to sign up for a PhD on albatrosses on Marion Island, which is a little South African sub-Antarctic island. I was actually told, you can't do that because there are no toilets for women on the ship. This was 1984, the dark days. But nonetheless, I never, in the end, decided to do that. I worked on other things. But my institute at the University of Cape Town works a lot on seabirds. And so I've been exposed to all the bad news about seabirds, from plastic engorgement of their stomachs. And if you haven't seen the film Midway about seabirds and plastics, please Google it and look it up. It's now freely available online and heartrending, and it will make you think twice before buying anything made of plastic. But also the other issues that we are, that kind of lethal cocktail of multiple threats from different directions to species in the ocean environment, including the introduction of mice, invasive alien mice, onto subantarctic islands, which then eat the albatross chicks alive because there are no natural predators. So on that line, we have problems, yes, and it's hard to put a good spin on that. I'm sorry. Things are very, very severe, and we have to completely change the way we think about our consumption, especially those of us in North America, and how we choose to buy things. But we are also, I do want to say, it's not just our individual choices. We are all trapped in large systems of an economy that values waste, values consumption. And we have to change that. We do not have a choice but to change that if we want a habitable planet. But Susan also mentioned insects and specifically pollinators, and so I'll briefly touch on that. And Andrew and other people had mentioned, when they were talking about the observed loss of biodiversity, the fact that we all used to be able to, as kids, drive in a car and get out and see moths and butterflies and other insects plastered across the radiator grills of our cars. And that's not really happening anymore. And we know that pollinators, including honeybees, are dropping rapidly from our systems. Now that affects almost everything that most of us eat. Everything that is insect pollinated, from watermelons and grapes to berries and all kinds of vegetables, tomatoes, and so on. So I used to have a sign up on my fridge that showed a standard picnic meal, what it would look like if there were no pollinators. Maybe some of you have seen that graphic. It's pretty distressing. But again, we have hit honeybees and other pollinators with a lethal cocktail of multiple threats from different angles. There's pesticide use. For goodness sake, please don't use pesticides. And if your neighbors still are, speak to them about it. Often the word of a trusted neighbor or family member influences people where others might not, or facts might not. But also the stress of moving bees around from almond grove to almond grove and across the country, here to Wisconsin to pollinate this, and then off to Texas to pollinate that. Those poor bees are confused and stressed, just like humans are when we take a plane and fly around the world in a couple of days. And it's messing with our immune system, and it's messing with their immune system. And so you have heard the phrase colony collapse disorder in bees. And I've started writing about the subject of colony collapse disorder in humans because I think that we are suffering immunologically from some of the same problems.
Thank you, Phoebe.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, Roger.
I live in the valley here in California, and we own a business, farm supply. But so we're concerned about the farmer and what's going on. My wife and her sister grew up here in the valley. What we found out is that if you drink the well water, that it has enough insecticides and things that affects your thyroid. My wife has had thyroid problems all of her life. And the amount of thyroid problems are extensive here in the valley. People who have drunk water from the wells get, so my wife was not able to have children. So we've been talking about the animals and insects and so on. Also, what's happening is it's happening to us. The rate of cancer and this affecting the thyroid and all the thyroid problems. Just wanted to.
Thyroid problems are becoming really common, and I imagine that many of you know people who have had thyroid cancer or other thyroid pathologies. At our house, we were talking about it just yesterday, a really serious problem. And although it's a small sample, Roger, 3 of my friends who have had thyroid cancer in their 20s and 30s were not able to have children too. So I wouldn't like to say that that's a scientifically grounded result, but I am concerned about the things you raise, and I'm sorry for your wife's troubles with that, because it affects us all. It's a trouble for us all, and our shared humanity should make us be grieving about these things and working hard to change them as fast as we possibly can. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm getting notices here about moving on time-wise, although I think we could all just keep asking questions and give up anything else. You've already really spoken to this slide and the questions we had, and around just reminding us of the things that are driving biodiversity loss. So the habitat, climate, invasive species, overpopulation, pollution. We'll just have to keep this conversation going. I'm going to have, Joan wants to ask you a question about overpopulation as an environmental driver of biodiversity loss.
So Phoebe, if you can hear me, I was fascinated to see the headings for these columns, and I noted that overpopulation is one of, and I'm assuming that's human overpopulation, is one of the drivers of this biodiversity threat. And it's kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to discussions on climate change, because it's one that people don't seem to want to talk about and acknowledge and look at. But I was fascinated by your comment, and you just made a brief comment about one of the urgent needs in the world is for investment in reproductive and health education. And I don't know if this is your area or not, but I'd be interested to learn more of your perspective about what is it that we need to do to help the situation that can be the most effective and also humane.
I think we've lost Phoebe to the call.
Okay,
There's an organization called Population Connection. Have a magazine.
Have a good evening.
All right. Good night.
Thank you,
Phoebe.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over her.
It's okay.
Anyway, yeah, there's an organization called Population Connection, and they have a magazine that addresses this issue. And it can be a very touchy issue depending on a lot of religious, cultural kinds of things that make it kind of often difficult to address. But again, I think somebody mentioned education and human reproduction and that kind of thing. And I think it's an important area that we should address and look at carefully and see, what can be done.
Thank you. Joan, did you have any other comments you wanted to make relative to your question?
I don't think so. Rod had his hand up though.
Yeah, I can't see everybody because all I can see is, so yes, please keep calling on. We'll tag team on all of this.
Yes, I spent several years on international development, especially with an elephant in the room, yeah, I do like to address it again. I'm not a super expert, but there are certain things that are quite clear that when it comes to development, the sort of singular best thing you can do is focus on women's education. Part of that's is the reproductive issues, but really, if you want to raise the standard of a people, a focus first and foremost on women's education is key. Of course, you want to focus on everyone eventually, but that's the key entry into elevating a people's standard of living. With that, as soon as that happens, there is, as far as I know, the last I looked, there is not a single country in the world whose population did not dramatically reduce to basically 2, and eventually you get to any developed country, it becomes slightly under 2. And it's only through immigration that Canada, the US, and such maintain. So I just wanted to make that really clear because it easily becomes a north-south issue. Oh, those people are having too many baby type issue. And that is all completely misdirected scripts, but very common. And so I just wanted to make that very clear, just as a quick rule of thumb on, quote, this, what is, yeah, often an elephant in the room doesn't get mentioned because it's all the sensitive stuff. No, it has a very clear path to success, and that's starting with educating women.
Thank you, Rod.
So, Lori, I thought I might read something that Phoebe sent to us, and we were working on follow-up from the Sunday webinar. in which she says, I have a global group of women talking about population and consumption as two of the 6 issues I'm working on. She says, women are from around the world, especially Africa, Asia, and South America, through her group, could speak more freely about family planning, environmental problems, consumption, and sexual power dynamics. She's kept her group to women because of those kinds of issues around the people who participate feeling free to have dialogue around those issues.
Thanks. Thank you. So as we look across the top of this graph that Phoebe shared with us about habitat change, one of the things I have noticed and kind of was going to ask her a question about to highlight is the different things that we can do to mitigate some of these different issues. In particular, the piece on habitat loss seems to me really critical to understand well, because when there are certain organizations like the Nature Conservancy whose choice about how to address all of these crises is to preserve habitat. Because we are so used to the really sexy, big creatures that we know and love. But for instance, when the American chestnut tree went extinct on the eastern seaboard in the 1800s due to the introduction of a fungus from the Chinese chestnut tree that came in through a world fair, there were billions of chestnut trees on the eastern seaboard, and when they were all lost, except for a few stragglers here and there that are too far apart to be able to reproduce anymore, it's known that at least 7 different species of moths also went extinct because that tree was a habitat. The very tree that got lost was a habitat that got lost for other creatures. And of course, in the tropics, the loss of habitat in the Amazon rainforest, and I'm going to ask Rod to speak to this, is a recognition of that as acreage is lost in the Amazon rainforest, because the tropics are the biggest hotspot for biodiversity on our planet, species are going extinct that we didn't even know existed because they're so specialized. So Rod, I'm going to put up and let you speak to your question around habitat loss in Brazil. So you had sent me this slide. I'll let you talk about this.
Sure, great, thanks. So this was a question I was going to ask Phoebe, but now I'll have to ask it and sort of give a much lower level answer because, of course, she is such a wonderful source of understanding on all of this. Okay, so what you're looking at then is a satellite photo from 1985. Maybe you can show the next one. 7 years later, look at the change. So this is looking down at the rainforest. Already by 1985, you can see 25% perhaps of this portion of the rainforest. What portion is that? It's a portion where a road was built. It all started with a road being built. They built a road all the way through the Brazilian Amazon. Now, why did they do that? Actually, for partially very good reasons, poverty. A number of Brazilians at the time were on the verge of starvation and such. So they built the road and allowed thousands of people to own sort of like 100 acres, let's say. So all along that road then, eventually there was the 100 acres that grew and it kept growing. It went from that then to, of course, who came in and who, of course, really wanted that road were mining companies and extractive companies and things like that. So that 7 years later, then you can see there's, yeah, the rainforest is slowly, completely disappearing. And of course, with that, all the biodiversity that people, we don't even know about. And I would have loved to have heard Phoebe speak to what is known about what was lost. So what did those farmers do? They, first of all, put cattle on it. Why? Because McDonald's needed the burgers, the meat for burgers, and the soy, because that's good, cheap protein for cattle. And so that starts to show the interconnected nature of these things. Starving Brazilians, you give them a plot of land, those small plots become bigger plots, they get taken over by massive companies. In come the multinationals to buy the cattle and the soy. And then you get into human rights because you get indigenous folks trying to defend their land. And on average, I think it's, 700 people, well, about 150 people a year of these people are killed. Lord knows how many really are and are threatened and things like that. So it gets into human rights issues and a number of things. Fortunately, the international community has helped to step in terms of these, quote, the McDonald-like companies, and McDonald's, of course, does not now get either its cattle or soy from the Amazon. So that is a signal that the international community, if it learns and becomes engaged, can make a difference. But there's still a lot of areas that could care less, and so the destruction goes on. But that's just to give you a sense that, look at these figures. That's from 2008 is the latest figures, where there was a 69% jump, and that goes on. They say that of the entire rainforest, we've lost, well, they're not entirely sure, 12 to 15% that will never come back. And again, getting back to tipping points, they say, again, nobody's sure, perhaps 25%, that if it gets up to 25%, because of the nature of ecosystems, the Brazilian rainforest creates its own ecosystems, creates its own clouds, it creates its own rains that of course waters it, and that cycle goes through and has been like that for thousands of years. That if 25% of the rainforest goes, that'll probably be it. And once the rainforest is gone, it's gone. So it's another example of a possible tipping point that, like Phoebe mentions, nobody knows quite where that tipping point is. It's just going to be there, and it'll be too late if we reach it. So again, an example of something that brings in some of the complexity, but again, also, if we can become organized and support these international organizations that keep their eyes on the ground, we can influence things. One of the things is simply organizations that buy up some of the Amazon and keep it protected is just, a good example of a non-violent, non-coercive way of protecting things. Put your money where your mouth is, kind of like international. So enough said. Thanks.
Thank you, Rod. That's really helpful. I really find this really important to highlight that there are these different approaches. And one of the things I'm noticing, even with what we're talking about, is just, again, how interconnected and interdependent everything, all of the food systems, all of the relationships, it's all about these relationships, creating these ecosystems and wanting then to protect land.
Just one thing, Lori. There was a big article in the Vancouver Sun this week about changing ocean currents and how cold water is moving down from the Arctic, from melting glaciers, down deep in the ocean and going south, taking the current down to the southern oceans, and then warm water coming back up. And it's changing the whole dynamic of how the ocean works and what species can survive where and everything. Maybe somebody could comment on that at some point.
Well, Phoebe, do you want to give that a nod?
I think that we've discussed a little bit about that. Gary, I'm sorry that I was trying to grab a link on the subject of the Amazon to paste in the chat function. So I only heard the last few words of your question. If you,
oh, I'm sorry.
If you could summarize that for me.
Well, there's an article in our local newspaper in the Vancouver Sun that ocean currents are changing and cold water is moving down deep, coming from the glacier melt and going down to the southern oceans, and then warmer waters being pushed up north. And it's changing the way species live and survive and what species are where in the oceans. And the whole dynamic of the ocean currents is changing the biodiversity in that particular environment. So
definitely, and I've seen plenty of that with my own eyes, albeit more in Southern Africa than here, where we were finding that satellite tagged penguins were having to forage so far away from their breeding grounds, for example, that in trying to bring fish back to the youngsters, there was starvation and the penguins were getting emaciated. So the African penguin, for example, has decreased by, I think, 96% of its population in the last 20 years. And that's a scary thing. And that is partly due to local overfishing and partly due to shifting currents. But I think also we have to be aware that shifting currents are posing a big, big, big continental climate shift for all of us. And some of you may have seen this quite significant article in the New York Times. You need a fairly fast computer to be able to see this, but I'm also going to put this in the chat function. I'm sorry, it's quite a long link. So it's the second link that I've just put in the chat function, the New York Times interactive map of how the change of ocean currents could be affecting Europe's and North America's climates, and indeed Africa's and South America's. So we've been playing with fire that we don't understand. We have to stop it. We do not need to have our wasteful societies. We do not need to be using poisons in our daily lives just for our convenience, so we don't have to bend down and pull out a weed. And I know many of us are older and maybe it's not easy to bend down and pull out a weed, but maybe we can get a local neighborhood kid to do it instead of spraying poisons on our driveway, like our neighbor 2 doors down was still doing last year.
Speaking of how interdependent we all are and how there is a role for the human, that's a great segue into our breakout group question. So I had wanted to pose with Phoebe a response, and then we're going to pose the same question: what is the human species' proper role in the web of life? But what we've noticed often is we get into these conversations and we say, well, all this is happening, but nature's going to heal herself and the earth is going to heal herself. And I'm not sure that we get that sense of the time spans involved to write things. And we are in the middle of this mass extinction that's being caused by humans and accelerated by humans. And yet we're also focusing here on healing and what humans can do to heal the planet. And so this just seemed like a good question for our breakout group. What is the human species' proper role in the web of life? And I want to give you a chance to respond to that. I'm going to put this question up and let you respond, and then I'll give the rest of the questions real quickly. And then we're going to go to about a 12-minute breakout group and let people kind of talk together again about what our role, what's our role and what's our proper role. And I would just say, actually, would you like to go ahead and respond to that now, or would you like to?
I would like to stop talking and hear more of what people have to say.
So this is the second question. How has what you've learned about the fraying tapestry of life shifted your sense of responsibility as a person of faith? Does the fact that as persons of faith, does it deepen our sense of responsibility to care for the earth? And I really don't mean that as a totally rhetorical question, but really an examine kind of question. And then we also, the actions that we're feeling drawn to in service of healing creation. So let me ask my team, and would you like to do this in breakout groups, or would you like to do this with Phoebe and just giving people a chance to respond? I'm going to look to the rest of the staff to see how they feel.
I think just doing it with Phoebe and keeping this kind of interaction going.
Yeah, that's what I'm feeling. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you, Susie. I just needed some backup.
I agree.
I agree. And then Dean, I'll let you kind of gauge when you want to move to the advocacy and action part of it. So responses to this question: what's the human species' proper role in the web of life? And as persons of faith, does that change or deepen our responsibility? And how?
Well, I believe that we're supposed to be caretakers, and the more I learn, the more I'm taking care of even the tiniest little insect that I find out in the garden.
Well, I think the human species is critically important. I mean, we're the ones created beings on Earth that have been given the ability to make decisions, to take responsibility, and we're the ones that are creating the problems, seems to me like, in large measure. So I would say that, yeah, we need to step up and take responsibility much better than what we've been doing. I think these sessions that we're having right now are definitely a step in the right direction, because it's helping us be aware. I was not aware that it was extensive as it is. So I appreciate knowing it's kind of scary, but it's a wake up call at the same time. So I'm certainly, how do I shift my responsibility? Well, I'll certainly be more careful. COVID right now, I go to the grocery store. What do they give me my groceries in and can't let me put it in my own bag? Plastic bags. So that's what they use. And so, there's so many things like that, and how to stop it. I guess each one of us maybe can find a way to do that for our own selves, but it seems like it needs to be broader than that as well, politically and those ways. So.
Thank you, Sherry and Laurie, for that. I'm reminded of the time when I was dealing with a little bit of a cancer scare back in 2007. I determined that I was going to try to completely get plastic out of my life. I'd been doing the normal things for some time, but now I really wanted to make it a focus. And I tried very hard for about 3 years to take my household consumption down to zero. But what I found was the first 50% is really quite easy. The plastic bags, the containers for food and so on. The next 30%, the next 20% is quite difficult. And the remaining 30% is almost impossible. And why? Because our whole economy is run on plastics in distribution and storage and everything else. And so individually we can do a lot, but it is our voice that is more important about changing the systems in which we operate. We cannot accept this wasteful, poisonous approach to living that we've all become used to. And we have to call for that to change. So yes, please speak to your supermarket manager and keep the pressure on him or her if, like ours, he backtracks and says, oh, COVID, we need plastics. Call people to account. And if they are constrained with corporate policies, then, go to the top if you can. But ultimately, we also need to address these systems. And some corporations have made quite a bit of profit over the years by delaying their own responsibility, by saying, oh, people can measure their carbon footprint and they can do this and they can do that, and putting the responsibility on us. It's a shared responsibility. We all as consumers, a horrible word, but as consumers, we have responsibility, but so do the corporates. Thank you for sharing that.
Joan.
Laurie, I'm wondering if you could put the screen share back up so we can still see the questions, because some of us have trouble keeping 3 questions in our mind at the same time. Okay. But I did want to share, when you talk about what's the appropriate human role, the thing that jumps out at me is that humans are the least important in terms of the web of life and the tapestry of life. We are probably the least important of any species. No other species depends on us for anything. Every other species on Earth would get along just fine without us, unless I'm mistaken about that. So sometimes we think of ourselves at the top, but I'm wondering if we should think of ourselves at the bottom.
I like that. Thank you. What do the rest of you think?
Yeah, and so I now cannot see the whole gallery view, so I'm going to let Dean and Susie call, do the scrolling back and forth to call on people. I kind of like a corollary of that question that Joan just asked that I would pose is, if it's going to take millions of years to repair the creative loss of all the genetic diversity, that if evolution is the way creation happens, that evolution is and the divine mystery is using for this creation of beauty and novelty in the world. And it's going to take millions of years and may mean the sacrifice of humans on the earth. Is it even important to have a species? Is it? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but how important is it to have the species that can appreciate this grandeur, who can speak of awe and know beauty? And I know we're not the only creatures that do that. So I'm asking that question to try to kind of broaden to this question about what is our proper role in the web of life. And yeah, just putting it out there, not as an answer, but just things I'm musing about. There's a chance that we won't make it through this if we don't act now. So I really,
I'll just tell her.
another person.
So I can't see the full screen of people either, Lori. So I think if people want to chime in, just speak up and we'll try to manage the competition.
One of my answers to what actions are you drawing in service of healing is the consumption issue. Packaging is the bane of our society. And I'm a big coffee drinker, so I have coffee every morning. And I love my chocolate. And I recently heard where children are being abused by the chocolate in the chocolate industry. And so I think that if one of my responsibilities is to be a wiser consumer and not yield to so much of my cravings and be more mindful of the domino effect of what I choose to put in my life.
Well, I think that our role.
Barbara.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I think that our proper role is to be people who respect nature, because nature pretty well takes care of itself. God created it for that purpose. And I remember reading about the coyotes, that they even, don't ask me how, but practice birth control according to how much the food source is. So, you know, that's really something that I think we need to respect. And another thing that I remembered was I was visiting friends in Belize, and they have a little island about 40 miles out in the ocean off the coast. And we were headed out that way in this little fishing boat, 8-man fishing boat. And this woman is kind of scared of water, but I did thoroughly enjoy the trip. But on our way back from that little island was a huge freight liner. And I was warned by the person who was owner of the boat, and he said, pretty soon you're going to see massive amounts of garbage. And sure enough, the boat passed in front, or the ship passed in front of us. And as the waves kind of kept coming our way, they released their garbage. And I mean, it surrounded us. It was almost like an attack on us. That really, I cried. I thought, oh my, how many ocean liners and cruise ships and so forth and so on are allowed to do that? I don't understand that.
They're not allowed to do it, but a number of them do it anyway. And you may know that each port has facilities for taking on garbage and bilge water and sewage. And it's often cheaper and simpler for some cruise liners and some transport ships to dump it in the ocean. And that's been the problem. So we need the penalties to be high. We need all kinds of things to change. And there's not much time left to change it. I agree with you. It's horrific. It really is horrific. And if any of you do go on cruises, please research that issue carefully and look at that company's carbon footprint and that company's record for good environmental stewardship. And be aware that a lot of times they talk about it nicely, but you want to see the actual record. Thank you, Barbara, for mentioning that. It's really important.
If I may share, our responsibility lies in our political awareness. We need to be informed. and we need to contact our Congress people because this is so important. This has a lot to do with protecting our environment. Big changes are happening in Montana right now because of big shift in the state political party. And things are happening that are not kind to our environment. So it's very, very important that we have to remember to be politically involved and contact our congressmen. Thank you.
Another, could I?
Go ahead, Nancy.
We had the opportunity to go to Ghana for our daughter's wedding, our exchange daughter's wedding. And I there saw all of our garbage on their beaches. And the need, even in some of the little small resort areas, and also in India, we've seen the same thing, where basically they have to hire people every day, multiple times a day, to come out and sweep and clean the plastic and garbage off the beaches. And it just made me, it came home to me so aware that we are so interconnected with all the people in the world, and those especially who don't have some of the luxuries that we have. We are doing them a huge, huge disservice by, sending our garbage into their lives. And it totally changed the way that I kind of saw the whole problem with plastics and with garbage and with the way that we think about our privilege, and it's that aspect also of who we are as human beings and individuals that we really are going to be accountable for how we treat every single individual, every creature on this planet.
I wanted to jump in and raise something about the timelines. And I first became sort of aware of this in a book called The Wayfinders by Wade Davies, who's an anthropologist at UBC. And he talks about the ancient wisdom, and I'm sure many of you have encountered this. And I think it's really important to realize how much our consumerism has been driven in the last, say, 300 years. And so that if we could reach back to ways of living in balance, I'm becoming increasingly, or not increasingly, but I'm questioning more and more about the caretaker role of human beings, because I think that has been taken by the consumerism or woven into the story of consumerism, and we have dominion over, as opposed to we must live in harmony. So I just wanted to raise that. And the second point I wanted to make is, and I don't want to get off topic here, the danger of continuing the colonialism when we talk about the damage that we have imposed on others from, say, the Western world, and yet not recognizing their needs and their need for self-determination. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Rob. Go ahead.
This is David DeGarth, and I wanted to comment about the role of humans on this earth. From that religious perspective, I say, yes, we are stewards. We need to do everything we can to protect the earth and take care of it. And then on the other hand, You all live in a house. That house is pollution to nature. How are you going to remove it? No, you're going to live in that house. So I think we have a responsibility to build communities of joy, hope, love, and peace, which means we have to find ways to build communities, even though they totally destroy the nature where those communities are. We still have to try to find ways to live with nature as we do that.
Thank you, David. Others who want to comment or ask questions of Phoebe?
I was just noticing in today's LA Times that they're on the front of the second section, or B section, they're combing the seafloor off of Catalina Island with Roombas. And what they're looking for is the DDT barrels that were just thrown into the ocean and are off the coast of California. You know, and I think up north, I think there is radiation and stuff that way. And as I think Gil said, that we really need to talk to our people that can do something about these things in politics and so on. This was set up by the university and their effort to go out and find these barrels and get rid of them. But that is one way of action, through our universities and through different groups that are trying to find these sources and amplify their message and support their efforts.
I'm finding that I'm becoming increasingly aware and increasingly frustrated by the fact that I have very little understanding of the interconnectedness of all this stuff we're talking about. I mean, you know, the big thing right now is electric vehicles. China, apparently to what I saw on the article the other day, produces 27 million automobiles a year. Now I could calculate, if I had a brain that would work that way, the number of tons of pollution, carbon monoxide that would go into the atmosphere from those vehicles. But what about the cost of building them? What about the cost of running those factories? What about the stuff that has to go in, like catalytic converters that take up, you know, precious metals in order to make them work? And what's the cost of manufacturing and controlling, putting those precious metals into those catalytic converters? I don't have any idea when it comes to that, or when it comes to oil, for example, oil transportation. Yeah, we want to get rid of the oil. We want to be not dependent on fossil fuels anymore. But how long is it going to take before those 27 million vehicles in China that they just built last year are going to be transferred over to some other kind of system? And what do we do in the meantime? Is it better to build a pipeline that has what's the ratio of leakage from a pipeline versus the ratio of leakage and accidents from trucks and railway engines that are carrying this stuff now? Like, I want to know how all these things fit together and what's better and what's not, and why, if I do this, what are the ramifications down the road that I haven't even thought about? And those are the things that really frustrate me right now. I just don't know enough to really make informed decisions even.
Gary, go ahead, Dean.
I was just going to ask Phoebe, you know, how have you grappled with those dilemmas that Gary has spoken about?
It sometimes seems too complicated to try and make decisions, and we don't want to go into analysis paralysis every time we go into a shop. But what I would say is that we need to, one, be conscious that everything we do has an impact. How can we try to minimize that, live lightly, and act wisely? Two, I've put some links in the chat function just now about the circular economy versus our current linear economy and what happens to stuff we buy, use for a minute or two, or sometimes maybe a month or two, and then throw in the trash. And if you don't know the Story of Stuff project, that's a good place to start. And three, I think I would say that in my life, I just started to adopt a mindset of being aware of our tendency as a species to say out of sight, out of mind, and to actively fight against that. So everything that I put in the trash or everything that I buy, I do try to think, you know, what's the history of this product and where will it go from here? And can I rather keep it in circulation in my community with clothes swaps or food banks or other ways of using resources more efficiently? And so we all have the tendency, including me after 50, almost, well, 40 years of working on this, because when I was 17, I started managing a recycling depot as part of my school, high school community service. But, you know, even I fall into the trap of thinking, oh, somebody's bought me this plastic. I don't want it. I'm just going to put it in the bin. I close the cupboard door and phew, I don't have to think of it anymore. Now, let's not beat ourselves up about things, but make a decision, a conscious decision to decrease our impact in every way possible and ask questions, talk to our neighbors, call up our local recycling waste management service in our town, ask questions, but also more broadly about the systems, ask our candidates for elected office what they plan to do about our broken systems of the economy, society, and politics. What do they plan to do, and how can you help?
Thank you, Phoebe. I wonder if, Laura, you could bring up the slide that lists the organizations that have been mentioned earlier in this conversation and the prior presentation. And I think what I want to do, because what we've really been discussing here is the question of how do we find our way as individuals in this complex web of issues, is to, first of all, mention that there are opportunities that emerge. And I'll give you an example that occurred for me just after our webinar with Phoebe a week ago. A day after that, I had a post in Facebook from a person reminding us all to advocate and lobby for the Washington Strong bill to get brought out of committee. And it prompted me to pose the question that Phoebe had raised about whether the language in the bill adequately reflected the need for trees to mature to an age that allowed them to sufficiently sequester carbon and to preserve old growth forests that do such a good job of that. Those kinds of opportunities arise in our lives if we pay attention to them, in addition to just the daily routines that Phoebe has talked about in terms of how we live our lives as consumers and with simplicity. And I think in the chat, there have been other notes and organizations put in. I think we'll be able to preserve those. And I suspect any links you'll be able to see them in some fashion as we produce the results of this of this conversation. I want to move us now to, first of all, allow Susan to remind us about our next session in April, and then we'll close with a brief poem that Susan will read to us. Susan?
Thank you. I just want to alert you that we do have a continuation of this conversation coming up this Thursday, March 18th at 6 o'clock. That's Pacific Daylight Time. So you are welcome to join again. Invite your friends. There will be also some newcomers. And then our next webinar will be talking about human impacts of climate change. What the populations in low-lying islands all the way to the high Andes that are being impacted by climate disruption and the changes that are occurring because of carbon emissions and disruption to the balance of nature. The guest presenter is Dr. Richard Waugh. He is a professor emeritus in geography from the University of Wisconsin. He's an elder in the church. He has published several articles in church publications, the Herald and John Whitmer Society. So you may have come across Richard Waugh's name. And I might mention he's also my brother. I respect and love him very much, and can tell you from past conversations that he's has done a lot of teaching about climate change in his university studies, and his focus in geography is social geography, dealing with the way in which geography and the earth impacts human beings and vice versa. Human beings impact geography. He'll be speaking from some of his own personal experiences. We will have more webinars coming up about eco-racism and social justice, the economic and political solutions. I might mention that we are in the process of confirming someone who'll be talking about the cyclical economy that Phoebe mentioned, and the behavior that keeps us from understanding, contemplating, and acting on serious issues like this. So stay with us. If you've not yet registered at seaofchristclimatejustice.org, that is our website. And once you've registered there once, you will get all of our invitations to the webinars and the conversations. Thank you very much for being here, for your thoughtful comments and questions and concerns. See you next time.
Susie?
Susie?
Phoebe, I can't see you, but I'm talking to you mostly. During our preparation for a series of conversations last fall, I was looking for a poem or a reading that would sort of capture the essence of that session. I came across lots of beautiful poems, and none of them really hit my core. And one Saturday, I went to the farmer's market, as usual, to walk and to think and to have conversations, to look for hope and to pray. As I was leaving the market, there was a person sitting outside the market at a very small typewriter. And I was just curious, and I walked up and I just watched her sitting there typing. And then I noticed the sign beside her that said, "Would you like me to write a poem for you?" I didn't hesitate, of course, and said yes. She asked for my name and we engaged in conversation. I told her I wanted a poem about building a bridge of hope for the future in these challenging times. She paused and looked at me and said, "Well, that may take a little longer. Can you come back later?" Which we did. And I just want to read you just a bit of the poem, A Bridge of Hope. It is the taking of the step that calls. It is the taking of the step that calls the earth to rise to meet it. What needs to be found can only be built stone by stone, pebble by pebble, hope by hope, word by word, many speakers, many singers, many builders, waiting to be told what to do. But what is needed has never been done before. We all must be the blind leaders in the dark, mouths dry and singing prayers off key, our hands full of dust and pebbles and our grandmother's seeds. Be the mad woman leading the way. Trust your love and trust this path will change you. Trust others will join you. Phoebe, hope has been an important theme for our series, and I just would like to ask, what gives you hope?
Everything gives me hope. Groups like this give me hope. Children and teenagers and 20-somethings give me hope. What doesn't give me hope are very few things. Some of my baby boomer complacent neighbors, but almost everything else does. We find hope in love and cheerfulness. And as I think I said last week, I am lucky to be born with an inveterately cheerful DNA from my mother and a questioning personality from my father. And each of us must tap into those things within us that give us the best opportunity to pull ourselves out if we start to feel discouraged or helpless or fatalistic, even worse. This is not the time for nihilism. This is not the time for fatalism. We don't have many years left to 2030. And the things that we need to do by 2030 really need to be done in the next 3 years, not to wait until the 6th, 7th, 8th year. Because the faster we make transformative changes, especially to our energy systems and our economy, the better will be our trajectory, the faster we can reduce emissions, and the better the lives of our children. So all of those things give me hope that putting our collective shoulders to the wheel, talking to our neighbors and friends and family and faith communities, will all continue to achieve this tipping point that we all so fervently hope for.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you so much for being here, Phoebe. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'd like you to leave and think about for yourself what gives you hope. And thanks again, and we are done. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you, Susie and Dean, for inviting me in the first place. It's a privilege to meet you all and spend time with you. Thank you.